Today, we will see how do we find the amplitude and the period of a function. We have been seeing as to how we find out the period and the amplitude whenever a graph is being given to you. But today, we will see how can we still find the amplitude and the period whenever a function is being given to you that will not give you the graph, that will give you a function, and we're going to be able to find out the amplitude and the period just by analyzing the function. Now, two ideas that we need to keep in mind is that the amplitude, it's always going to be located in front of the function. And we're going to use the inside of the function to find the period. So here, these are two ways that we need to keep, two ideas that we need to keep in mind. The amplitude is located in front of the function. And inside the function, we will use that information to find out the period. So inside period, outside amplitude. So let's see, what do I mean by this? Well, here are some properties of a cosine function, and this also extends to sine function. These are properties for cosine and sine function. So let's see. Again, these properties are only true for cosine and sine. Now again, here's a generic way to graph a cosine function. Y equals some number times cosine of b theta. That number that is in front of the function, it's going to be our amplitude. And again, we have discussed that the amplitude is always positive. So that's why we put the absolute value next to it. And here, the number that is in front or inside the cosine function, which is b, we're going to use that to find the period. Because if we want to find out the period, we're always going to use 2 pi over b. So let me write down here on the side, the period, it's always going to be 2 pi over b. Again, the amplitude is the number in front of the function, and the number that is inside the function, we're going to call that our b, which we can use to find the period because the period is 2 pi over b. And again, this is only true for sine and cosine functions. So let's do some examples. Now, here, let's find the amplitude and the period for the following. The amplitude is the easiest to find because if you notice here, what's the number that is in front of the cosine function? That's a 2. Well, that's your amplitude. The amplitude is 2. That's it. Nothing fancy here. That number, it's always positive. So the amplitude is 2. Now for the period. For the period, you need to find out what b is. Now b is going to be the number inside the function, which in this case is 3. Now you got to remember that for us to find the period, that's going to be 2 pi over b. But we know what b is. B is 3. So that means that the period of the function is 2 pi over 3. And that's it. Amplitude, the number in front of the function. Period, we need to find out what b is. Where b, it's always going to be the number inside the cosine. We use our formula, 2 pi over b, so we just plug it in, and that's what we have here. So let's see. Let's start with the easy one, the amplitude. What is the amplitude of this function? It might seem like if there's no amplitude because there's no number in front of it, but you need to remember there's always that imaginary one there. So that says that my amplitude is 1. Now for the period, we need to find out what b is, where b is the number inside the function, which in this case is 2. So that says that my period is 2 pi over b. So that means that we're going to have 2 pi divided by 2. Notice that the 2's will cancel out. So that says that the period for this function is just pi. Let's look at example 3. What's the amplitude? The number in front of the function. which in this case is just 4. And what's the period? The period is the number inside the function. Well, I'm sorry, the period, we use 2 pi over b to find the period of the function. B is the number inside the function. So now we just plug it into our formula, 2 pi over b, but we found that the b is 3. So that says that my period is just 2 pi over 3. Look at another example here. Now, here's one thing that a lot of students might get confused. The amplitude, it's always positive. So here, some students might just put -2 as an amplitude, but you gotta remember that the amplitude, in theory, is the absolute value of a. So if we take the absolute value of -2, which is the number in front of the function, that's just 2. The amplitude is always positive. So in this case, even though we have a -2 in front of the function, my amplitude, it is positive 2. Now if we want to find the period, the first thing they want to do is find out what b is. B is the number inside the function, which is 1/2. So that means that the period of the function is 2 pi over b, which is 1/2. We don't leave our answers as a denominator with the fraction. So it's the same to divide by a fraction than to multiply by the reciprocal of the denominator. So it's going to be 2 pi. Division, change it to multiplication. 1/2 becomes 2 over 1. Any number, you can always put it over 1. So 2 pi times 2, that's just 4 pi. 1 times 1, which is just 1. But it is the same if we just write it as 4 pi. Because 4 pi divided by 1 is just 4 pi. So that means that my period is 4 pi. Let's look at the last example here. Amplitude is always positive, which is the number in front, which in this case is just 2. Straightforward. For period, we need to find out what b is, which in this case b is pi. Remember that the period for the function is 2 pi over b. We found out that b is equal to pi, so now we have 2 pi over pi. Notice that here, the pi's will cancel out. So at the end, we just have 2. This is how you find the amplitude and the period of function. The amplitude is the number in front of the function, which is always positive, and the period, we're always going to use the same formula, 2 pi over b. So your task is to just find out what b is, plug it in, and simplify if possible. Here's your entrance ticket. Find the amplitude and the period for the following.